Good evening and welcome. I'm Christy Pearson with Friends of the Hennepin County Library. And thank you so much for joining us for our second summer evening at Talk of the Stacks, a free author series that invites today's most compelling writers to discuss their most recent work. And what a discussion we have in store for you this evening. We are so proud to welcome 2022 Pulitzer honorees Diane Seuss and Vang, whose works of poetry are published by local powerhouse Grey Wolf Press. But first, on behalf of the library and friends, we would like to begin tonight with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that in Hennepin County, we live and work on the ancestral and traditional lands of the Dakota people. This land and the Dakota people belong together. And by offering this land acknowledgement, we commit to recognizing and supporting Indigenous nations and to holding ourselves accountable to the work of reconciliation. Thank you. Well, I'd next like to recognize our sponsors who help make this series possible. Many thanks to the Star Tribune, LSC Architects, and Nor Companies for their generous support. And now, since tonight is all about celebrating the power of the written word, I have a special update about how our library is spreading the joy of reading through neighborhoods across the county this summer. Thanks to funding from friends like you, the library is on track to distribute more than 8,000 giveaway books at local parks, community events, and gatherings across the county. Now, research shows that children who own their own books often become lifelong readers. And this is just one of the ways that our library is reaching outside its physical walls to spark the joy of reading in our youngest patrons. So we at Friends are proud to support our library colleagues as they make these life-changing visits. So please be on the lookout for that Hennepin County Library van at your next neighborhood event. And just a couple of tips I have to pass along to help you better enjoy tonight's virtual experience. Although I have to say by now, we're probably all pretty expert at this. If you would like to use captions, click on the up arrow next to the closed captioning icon and select Show Subtitles. And if you would like to ask one of our authors a question, you can click on that icon at any time to log your question. And now it is my pleasure to invite our wonderful guest to the screen. Tonight's moderator, Jeff Schatz, is executive editor at Grey Wolf Press, where he also serves as the director of poetry. In this role, he proudly shepherded both of tonight's featured authors as they brought their Pulitzer-honored work to publication. Our first guest of honor, Diane Seuss, is the 2022 winner of the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry for Frank Sonnets. This collection vividly redefines the conventional sonnet form in unconventional terms, which has been hailed a brilliant and devastating account of the making and survival of a poet. Seuss is also the author of 4 other poetry collections, including Four-Legged Girl, which was a Pulitzer finalist, and Wolf Lake, White Gown Blown Open. Our next guest of honor, Vang, was a Pulitzer finalist in poetry this year for her collection, Yellow Rain, a groundbreaking work that reopens America's wrongdoings in Vietnam for a new reckoning. She is also the author of Afterland, which was a winner of the first book award from the Academy of Poets and a recipient of the Lannan Literary Fellowship. We are thrilled to welcome both honorees to Talk of the Stacks, and it is my pleasure to invite Jeff Schatz and Diane Seuss to the screen to begin tonight's program. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Christy, and thanks to you, Diane. So wonderful to see you tonight. Thanks from all of us from Grey Wolf Press to you, Christy, and to Rob Gowdy and everyone at the Friends of the Hennepin County Library for hosting this evening's event, but also just, for all year long and for many years, bringing so many extraordinary writers like Diane and Maider, to Hennepin County, to Minneapolis, all year long, in person and virtually through the Talk of the Stacks, which really is one of the just premier reading series in the Twin Cities. So it's a real extra honor for us to be here. Thanks to everybody for tuning in with us. I wish we were gathering, obviously, in Minneapolis in that beautiful downtown library, but we feel your energy here beaming in from the Twin Cities and really all around the world. So thanks for being alongside us tonight. Of course, I want to give a big thank you so much to Diane Seuss and to Vang for being here tonight. All of us at Grey Wolf are just so honored to celebrate you and your work and have this opportunity to do that again. And also just the extraordinary recognitions for both of your books. I mean, just what an extraordinary year you both have had. So congratulations to you both. Thank you forever for entrusting your works with us at Grey Wolf. That means everything. So a little housekeeping. We will hear Diane and Maider each read for 10 minutes or so each from their poetry, and then we'll have some conversation. After which we'll have some time for audience questions. So please, at any point, type in your questions using the Q&A function on Zoom. So first, we will hear from Diane reading from Frank Sonnets. Please welcome the magnificent Diane Seuss.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you so much. And to everybody who made this evening possible, all my friends at the library. And let me just say how important libraries were to my upbringing as a reader and a writer. There would have been no way that I could have owned books, but to be able to borrow them changed my life. So thank you so much for the work you do. And of course, Jeff and Maider, my friends and colleagues. I'm going to read 3 sonnets from Frank. There is a certain state of grace that is not loving. Music, Kurt says, is not a language, though people say it is. Even poetry, though built from words, is not a language. The words are the lacy gown. The something else is the bride, who can't be factored down even to her flesh and bones. I wore my own white dress, my hair a certain way, and looked into the mirror to get my smile right, and then into my own eyes. It's rare to really look, and saw I was making a fatal mistake. That's the poem, but went through with it anyway. That's the music. Spent years in a graceful detachment. Now silence is my lover. It does not embrace me when I wake, or it does, but its embrace is neutral, like God or Switzerland since 1815. This poem really tells it's sort of a litany of my life on the road and all the places I've slept. I've slept in many places for years on mattresses that entered my life via nothing but luck. As a child on wet sheets, I could not contain myself. As a teen on the bed where my father ate his last pomegranate. Among crickets and chicken bones and ditches, in the bare grass on the lavish grounds of a crumbling castle, in a flapping German circus tent, in a lean-to, my head on the belly of a sick calf, in a terrible darkness where a shrew tried to stay afloat in a bucket of well water, in a blue belfry, on a pink couch being eaten from the inside by field mice, on bare floorboards by TV light with Mickle on Locust Place, on an amber throne of cockroach casings, on a carpet of needles from a cemetery pine, in a clubhouse circled by crabapple trees with high school boys who are now members of a megachurch, in a hotel bathtub in St. Augustine after a sip from the fountain of youth, cold on a cliff's edge, passed out cold on train tracks, in a hospital bed, holding my lamb like an army of lilacs. Maybe I have time for two. This one kind of rises up in diction. There is a force that breaks the body, inevitable. The byproduct is pain, unexceptional as a rain gauge, which has become arcane. Rhyme likewise, unless it's assonant or internal injury. Gloom, joy, which is also a dish soap, but not the one that rids seabirds of oil from wrecked tankers. That's dawn, which should change its name to dusk. Irony being the flip edge of sentimentality here in the Iron Age. Ironing out the kinks and despair, turning it to hairdo from hair, to do, vexing infinitive. Much better to be pain's host, body of Christ as opposed to the Holy Ghost. When I've been suffering at times, I could step away from it by embracing it. A blues thing, a John Donne thing. Divest by wrestling, then sing. And I'll end with this one for my mama, whose birthday was yesterday. And for the sonnet who carried me a long way. The sonnet, like poverty, teaches you what you can do without. To have, as my mother says, a wish in one hand and shit in another. That was an answer to I wish I had an Instamatic camera and a father. Wish in one hand, she said, shit in another. She still says it. When she tells me she wishes I were there to have some of her bean soup, she answers herself. Wish in one hand, she says, shit in another. Poverty, like a sonnet, is a good teacher. The kind that wraps your knuckles with a ruler, but not the kind that throws a dictionary across the room and hits you in the brain with all the words that ever were. Boxed fathers buried deep are still fathers, teacher says. Do without the, without and, without hot dogs and your baked beans. A sonnet is a mother, every word a silver dollar. Shit in one hand, she says, wish in another. Thank you, and back to Jeff.
Thank you so much, Diane. Shit in one hand, wish in the other. Thank you so much for that reading. It's always really remarkable to get to hear you. So thank you. Now we're going to hear from Maidur, reading from Yellow Rain. Please welcome Maidur Vang.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And what a just amazing opportunity it is to hear you read, Diane. I've just been a huge fan following you all year long, and it's nice to finally share in this communal space together. while we celebrate our poems and our work. So thank you so much for sharing this moment with me. Thanks for that too, Jeff. And also I just want to thank the friends of the Hennepin County Library for organizing us, thanking also Gray Wolf Press for making all of this happen, making our books happen. And yeah, I'm just delighted to be here. So I will be reading from Yellow Rain, and I probably will read about maybe 3 poems. So for me, this book, has been sort of a decade of my work, my life's work, and kind of an obsession in a way. And it's a book that reinvestigates the issue of yellow rain, which was a chemical biological weapon that was used against Hmong refugees as they were fleeing from the jungles of Laos just after the end to the US wars in Vietnam and the end to the US proxy war in Laos. And over time, what happened was that the Hmong stories and testimonies of Yellow Rain were eventually discarded and invalidated. And so the work that I've been trying to do in this book is an attempt to challenge the dismissing of those allegations and to try and push against the erasure of that history. So the first poem I want to read is from the beginning of the book. They think our killed ones cannot speak to us. As if to adjourn all oxygen from the neck is how they try to take the voice. As if attempts to render us pale, ripped lungless from woke into wild ash. As if ashes cannot blink, howl, testify with the pulse of their own tatters. As if hymn and whistle, hail and pour. We've seen how they shame the light, stripped hollow, tearing out filigrees of stars from protocols of dust to make drink a bouquet of venom, sprayed down a constellation's throat. They must be so earless, as if we've no legs to kneel. We are each other's memory of the future 40 years from here, arriving at ourselves by way of the dead. History will not beget powder, will not beget myth, will not make us into marginalia. As ever possessed by what we have lost, there are no language barriers in the afterlife. A toxin is a toxin, is a toxin, is the man-made truth, is the dead who leave everything behind. All right, so one of the big driving factors of the whole Yellow Rain fiasco and investigation was were the thousands of blood and urine and vegetation samples that were submitted by refugees to the government, to the US government, and they were shipped all over the world to be tested. But all of that was in vain and was futile only because by the time they arrived to these labs, they had already degraded. And it was really hard at that point to test these samples. So this next poem is a poem that examines the futility of giving up these bodily samples to then be left with no result in the end. Authorization to depart ravaged homeland as biomedical sample. Flew you afar, piecemealed bits of spleen, liver, tissues of the second gut orphaned by the whole. Routed you in a vacutainer, Bangkok, Frankfurt delayed, Dulles, Fort Detrick, as if only born to serve in post-mortem. Detain offerings of cerebral shards to be juried under a lens. Flew you from the silken wilderness of your viscera, from all the vacated leftovers of yourself, sinews snipped, culled from the ribs. in this mission of guilt for your unleaving. You've trekked far from the village. Salvaged insides from you and other hundreds, sealed on letterhead, dispersed to the globe. Here at long last in these United States, you did not land a body. Only as a vial of blood were you registered as urine did they label you asylum. Sample M3582, victim 7 en route to London. Fluids of you granted fare to enter refugee airspace while ending away in a hospital camp, stayed behind the sourced you and every else part. Sample M2582, victim 9, no weekend courier, ambiguously arriving. So stomach of laments, how could they not get you here somehow? Only drops relayed lab to lab to lab. Cargo of you quaking inside an ice chest. And the last poem I want to read is a poem that opens with a few epigraph statements from some of the declassified documents that I used as part of the research for this book. A moment still waiting for you. Repeated description by medically unsophisticated victims. Properties that were ideal for chemical agents cannot reasonably and scientifically be attributed to a natural contamination. Firm conclusion that trichothecene mycotoxins are a component. Total composition of yellow rain is still unknown. Could not be the results of any natural phenomenon. Must have been the result of action by man. Come for all that belongs to you. All that waits for your unfeathered knowing in the anteroom of this information. A space becoming souvenir of the body's last bath to helix you into urgency as the remembering one. Open to receive everything you won't know so that in your uncertainty, you will come across love. As when before you were born, it was sky times, we seem to know our way around this labyrinth of air, drinking up seasons of the land with every new almanac of our lineage. We walked sensing our seamless cord to the roots above. It was always hard times, but at least we were free. At least we could dream of you being free to live out the structures of your heart. But we are such a demographic of spirits in that our hearts have always been broken down through the path, such that now we are a scattering of evidence, siloed from the gravity that once held our knees firm to each other, such that we feed on the crumbs of our survival every time we go missing in beggary. When the great motion happened before you came to partake in this earth's timing, many of us got caught in the rain and could not find our way, scraping the storm with our skin. It was our own flux to own, unable to meet the center, but endlessly falling toward aphelion. This time of deep secrets, we learned to put our trust in guessing, a waterfall born of mugwort, a meteor born of an ox, a rage born of a blade, a lesson born of cremation. It won't be long until you are born of the rug under the river, kicking open the book of your foe's timeline. You are not simply here, not simply present. What you are is not what anywhere expects of you. It's as subtle as an owl in astral flight, that what you are is not here, not this, not ever, but only now. Thank you all so much for tuning in, for listening. And now I want to turn it over to Jeff and Diane.
Thank you so much, my dear. It's so devastating to hear those poems read aloud and just how lyrical they are. Even even while you're marshaling so much information inside it is what so really came through in your reading. Thank you so much. Thanks to you both for engaging into some conversation, and just a quick reminder to everybody that you're all welcome to pose any questions you may have for our poets tonight using the Q&A function. So put those there, and Rob will moderate those after our conversation. But for now, Diane, my dear, let's talk a little recklessly.
Mm.
I mean, it strikes me, and I'm reminded every time just dipping into the books, but hearing you read from them tonight, that I mean, these are both just extremely gutsy books. I think it has to be said. And I mean, they both risk telling, they both risk telling truths that I think a lot of people want to shut out or shut up or erase, I think, in various ways. And I'm, Diane, I'm thinking of the way that in the sonnets, when you're daring to tell about your life, and you're daring to talk about poverty and suicide and AIDS and addiction and abortion, the sexual abuse perpetrated by male writers, and more. And I'm thinking of the way that in your book, my dear, it re-examines atrocities done to the Hmong people that have effectively been, as you mentioned, discredited by the US government and by the scientific community. And you also really boldly, we kind of heard that in your reading, but it's even louder, I think, in the book, really boldly writing about refugees and immigrants whose lives are essentially at the whims of the state. So, given the gutsiness of these works, I mean, what has been the reaction to your books? I mean, is there anything that has maybe surprised you about the responses you've received, since your books were published last year? Other than the Pulitzer Prize?
That was a shocker. How about, you want to start, my dear?
You know what? Feel free, Diane.
We can fight each other for. Well, I guess, I mean, I'm shocked at the visibility and the fact that so many people, and I don't just mean in the US, but all over the place, have said, yes, I get it. I've lived that, or my mother lived that, or whatever. So the incredible acts of connection and empathy, and I guess I just say the support. I'm a pretty hermitish person, and to feel that support, coming through even during a pandemic and with everything people are coping with, and to see the linkages, it has just been really life-altering and incredible. Your turn.
Yeah, I can sort of relate to this hermitage sort of outlook on life too, because I tend to think of myself as a hermit as well. But I think for me, it's surprised me just how in some ways people have been receptive to the book. I really was terrified writing this book, not knowing exactly how people would respond to it, not even knowing if it was going to succeed on my end, if I would even finish it. And so for me, I'm just happy that if for anyone to read it, really, I mean, that's just the great thing about being able to do something like this. But I think what has surprised me is that I have gotten, I've gotten sort of, messages, or people have told me, especially, Hmong friends or colleagues who have mentioned things like, I think I should talk to my parents about what happened to my uncle. It could have been Yellow Rain because he died mysteriously. So people have come and shared that with me. And it's really helped to kind of open other conversations for families who have not realized that what it could have been, in their situation, or what might have happened. So I think that really surprised me. And if the book has helped to do that, then I'm glad it's here and now in the world.
Yeah, I'm so moved to hear that, my dear, and to see so many people responding to that history that, like myself, I acknowledge I did not know until Afterland had the poem titled Yellow Rain in it, your first book. And then that really opened up this conversation for me alongside you and alongside your research and notes. And Diane, too, I was just really very moved recently that, seeing people sharing your poems in the wake of the overturning of Roe v. Wade, for example, I think was very moving to me.
Yeah. And to, well, my dear, your work is, it's kind of a cliche phrase, but I think it's true, as an active witness, but also uncovering. It's such an interesting interaction between erasure and exposure. And there's something so powerhouse about that, I think, for any reader to see the lyric voice in taking on that kind of risk and that kind of power, that you can literally uncover and renegotiate history, and that it has that kind of impact on people who are there and brings new truth to their lives. That's just stunning to me.
Thank you for sharing that, Diane. It's I think it's sort of the outcome of the work that we do as writers, and it's we don't realize what's happening as a result of the work, but it's creating these ripples, right, within people's lives and within the way that they're thinking about their own histories or their own futures. And I think that's what I guess, imagine that's what poetry can do, right? And your work has done that as well in so many amazing ways. I mean, these poems of yours are just pulsing with an energy that just like kind of revives me as I read them, all these sonnets. And that's what I just loved about Frank, was just the pulse of energy that really just resonated.
Yeah, I feel in service to poetry, and I think you seem to as well, that's the higher calling of what we do. And I'm so moved by what poetry has done and can do and will continue to do in the world. I don't have much of a sense of legacy, but I hope, not for me, but I hope poetry has that legacy, and that I'm a small part of it. That would be cool.
I'm struck by both of you, that I think that the kind of energy and power that you're both describing and praising each other rightly with, it kind of emanates from, I'm just very struck hearing you read and just struck every time entering these works, that the poems in the books are kind of positioned by a first person speaker. I mean, you're very careful and deliberate, I think, in those ways, a kind of lyric eye. And that lyric eye in your book, Diane, is in part narrating your life story, or it's sort of swerving in and out of flashes of personal memory or argument, or even kind of literary criticism. I mean, you use the sonnet in so many ways, but it sort of emanates through that first person speaker, Maider, the first person in your book, was attempting, was doing something very different by attempting we kind of sense your speakers, work and grappling with and attempting to make sense of narratives uncovered by, as you mentioned, vast research and archival work into Yellow Rain and into its history and into its cover-up. So for each of you, I mean, how stable is that lyric first person in these poems? And how much, really curious to hear both of you talk about, how much does that first person speaker change or shift in the course of your book? Are we meant to kind of read a drama, if you will, of the first person speaker across these poems? Or is there kind of a stable place from which the poems are spoken?
Challenging question, Jeff. I think it's your turn to start, Maider.
I was more interested in what you had to say to this question because your book is so deeply entrenched in that voice too, and yeah. I'm just curious. I'm
okay. There's a part of Frank where the I disappears, and that is in the poems that sort of speak out of the place where I'm from. And it's usually, it's either we or no pronoun. So I was very aware of the fact that as I went into those poems, the I needed to drop away. It still informs the poems, but the consciousness of a small place is a shared one. It isn't. In fact, I think I say somewhere in the book that, there's something a little suspicious about someone who sort of speaks from their I. That's a little dangerous. So, I guess I see the I as the one thing I have to hold on to as a writer in making the book. But it's slippery and it does have a trajectory. It moves from, a quite adult philosophical position in the beginning of the book through the childhood and then the disappearance kind of into the town where I was raised. And then, it moves through travel, movement, divorce, aloneness, and then sort of taking at the core, at the heart of the book, taking on my son's addiction and the trauma there for him primarily and for me, and then moves off from there. And I noticed in Four-Legged Girl and in Frank that by the end of the book, I've kind of claimed a incendiary sense of self, a self that's like, fuck it, basically. And that sort of takes on a sort of mythic power. And that accrues as a result of moving through all of the poems. So I don't know if that got anywhere at all to touch the question, but the I feel very grateful to it. And I don't see it as my walking around self at all. I see it as an aspect of self, but also a performance of self. And I'm always kind of thinking about that performance and the space between sort of me and here and the I in the poem, and how close or far away from in here I need to go in order to speak to the needs of that particular poem. Your turn. I feel lost.
No, that was a great response. I was following it, and yeah, I agree. I think that with Yellow Rain, I did have to, like you were saying, Diane, I had to look to the need of that poem, really, in order to figure out the position of that I or whatever perspective that poem was going to need in order to make its case. I think the challenging thing about writing this book is that I, on the one hand, readers who understand, who know the Yellow Rain history and were part of the investigation, maybe could see my positionality as biased as a Hmong person, right? Because here I am, I'm a Hmong person writing about Yellow Rain, and therefore I lack a kind of objectivity, perhaps, But yet on the other hand, I see myself as someone who is positioned to want to write about Yellow Rain, in some ways. And so for me, I think that, yeah, of course, it sometimes, you kind of throw that objectivity out the door so you can say what needs to be said in a poem. And that for me comes out more strongly with that I voice too. I can get as close as possible to the truth of what I'm trying to say. If sometimes I say it first in that I. And then sometimes what I do too is I play around with like switching up the pronouns. Actually, I see here, I think I saw a comment from Eduardo Corral, who is a friend and also one of my teachers, who helped me to kind of become the poet that I am. And one thing I learned from Eduardo was just try switching up your pronouns in the poem and see what happens. And that was something that I've used, is just to sort of re-examine the voices that are coming into these poems and what that does for the poem. So for me, I think I did sort of rely on the I did find some comfort in that voice, but there are poems too in this collection where I wanted to, I guess, maybe take a risk and write from the perspective of the people who basically messed up this entire investigation and who effed it all up, maybe I wanted to talk in their voice and maybe I wanted to assume their position and just speak a kind of truth that they couldn't say in their own voice when it was all happening. And that was very liberating to be able to do that, is to not feel so confined, and to be able to do what the poem needed, in order for the best possible voice to come through, in my case. Yeah. But I did write, I think you're right, Jeff. I think I did write from a place where it was really me talking in a lot of these poems to my reader. It was me talking to the victims. It was me talking to Yellow Rain itself. It was me talking to the investigator. It was me talking to sort of some of the sort of contested figures within the investigation. It was me being able to do that directly. And I think in a collection like this, I probably needed to do that, to finally be able to say what I felt needed to be said. Yeah.
It's a brave position.
Yeah, it is.
Sorry, Mike. And did you have a sense that your first person position changes across the book? I mean, there's this kind of, I'm struck by those first person poems that you have at the kind of in prose at the beginning of each section, and what you achieve in those positions, just to use that word. And we kind of sense a kind of change, I think, in the speaker's position across those sections and across the kind of argument of the book. Is that intended, or what's your sense of the arc of that change?
Yeah, I forgot about those prose pieces. Thank you for bringing them up. There's just so many moving parts of the book, but I think with those pieces, I think they did change. I think my voice did sort of kind of move in and out of something else, because I was, and on, there were moments where I had to kind of have a more reporterly like voice or more investigative voice. And then there were moments where I sort of, shifted back into something that felt more reflective and something that felt more like me, and so it does shift a little bit. And I think part of the struggle with writing some of those prose pieces was trying to figure out, okay, what kind of voice does it matter? Should I just write what I need to write right now and not feel so restricted by the idea of craft, of these pieces, and just allow what needs to come out for this moment to at least come out. And so, yeah, I do think they did change, just because, again, there were moments where I needed to give facts and information to my reader. And then there were moments where I just wanted to sit back and just say, you know what, this is all a mess. How, this was a fiasco. How can anyone make sense of this? And look, this is the collateral damage as a result of it. People like my parents and other refugees, I mean, they won't, just, it's all been like discredited to certain people in this country. And so it's just, yeah, I had to rely on all these different aspects of these voices to be able to then do what needed to be done in that moment, as opposed to like saying, I'm going to stick to just being very reporterly in these pieces, or I'm going to stick to being very objective in my approach. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm really struck that, in both of your books, we seem to catch your first person speakers in the act of making the poems. So, we sense in Frank sonnets, really from the very beginning, Diane, the kind of chronological accrual of the book being written. And of course we have sonnets, at least one of them that you read tonight, that meditate on the form of the sonnet itself. And we get that kind of conversation across the book too. It's as if your speaker is sort of letting us in on the writing of the book as a kind of friend or a kind of confidant. And in Yellow Rain, we experience the poems as a kind of accrual of evidence and documentation. As if the speaker, kind of as you were just saying, as if the speaker is a kind of detective, almost at certain points. So, I mean, it strikes me in both cases that it's a real act on your parts of generosity in each of the books, because it creates in them, even when you're talking about very large scale subjects, it creates a real intimacy inside the poems. I find that really extraordinary in both of these cases. But how important was that to you, to bring your reader inside your process, essentially?
When you talk about it that way, I think that Frank is, that in a sense, the autobiographical moments that are strung together in the poems are allegorical, and that what the book is really about is writing. And my love for writing, and how it's, I mean, the last poem in the book really is about that love, and its legacy, I guess. But yeah, I felt that the sonnet, those 14 lines, it allows for an intimacy with the reader that sometimes a bigger poem or a longer poem maybe is more kind of, here I am doing it, but and you're watching, sort of how I feel about Madonna sometimes. Like, oh, I'm the spectator, okay. But in the sonnet, there is space, I think, for the reader, more space. And there's space in between the poems as well. So I think there is, I mean, the sonnet is kind of an intimate form. I think about the Keats poem, "When I have fears that I may cease to be." I mean, God, how can I be more intimate with him than that?
Mhm.
So there, I think in its musicality, in its brevity, and in the fact that it has existed for so long that it's kind of a shared, um, you know, the sonnet to me is an archetype, and
Mm.
we share it. And so it invites the collective, it's a door, and it invites the watcher in.
Oh, I love that. I love that it's sort of the sonnet as a door or as a window into something, right? Yeah,
Mhm.
I love this conversation too about form, because I think when I'm thinking about sort of inviting a kind of generosity and a kind of intimacy into these poems, I thought a lot about the form of these poems too, right? What am I going to do, right, to create that with such a vast topic
Mhm.
that few people even know about, right? Even for me, like I was still learning about Yellow Rain too myself. How was I going to create a space for the reader to feel invested as in the same way that I was invested in it? And I think what I ended up looking at was the idea of form and what I could achieve with some of those compositions too. The more visual pieces in the collection where I'm kind of just using the space of the page to create a way for language to kind of coexist next to each other and see the relationship of those words in particular spaces of the page next to other words. Like when we think about what writing is, it's words next to other words positioned on a particular place on the page. And I thought very literally about how to do that with those composition pieces, because I think it was a chance for me to be able to kind of on just a very practical level utilize the documents, the declassified documents that I uncovered in the process of researching, but also create a slightly more maybe immersive experience too, not only for the reader, but for myself, right? I think when I was writing this, it's like I'm writing this for this book, but there's always a way in which we write this to feed ourselves too, as poets, as writers. And so maybe it's the forms in which I'm trying, it's in the forms of these poems in which I do try to create a kind of intimacy, a place where I know that I'm a little afraid to do something in a poem, or I'm afraid, like I'm a little nervous to try out these visual pieces because they're a little different from me, If I know that I'm being a little nervous in that sense, then it is the right kind of thing to offer my reader,
Mhm.
right? Like, I don't know how I feel about this. I don't know how Jeff's going to feel about this.
That's the big question.
Right. And so when you can get to that point where you're like, oh, I don't know, this is a little weird. This is probably not going to make sense, but let's try this, And that's when you know that you've created some kind of intimacy that hopefully your reader can access as well when they see that you've tried to do something that's just not in your comfort zone, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
And
You
the
get at
reader,
the unspeakable through those images.
Right. Yeah.
Uh, I was thinking, do you feel like you belong anywhere? Because I never did. And I wonder if poets are often sort of in that position of, there's the history of your parents who came here, and you're sort of floating between those two poles. And I
Oh,
wonder,
yeah.
yeah.
I always feel like the odd one out, especially in my family too. I'm the only person who does anything creative. Everyone else is doing something, but I do feel like I can absolutely relate to the idea of not feeling like I know where I belong or feel like I belong anywhere,
Mhm.
just floating
Yeah.
around, right?
And so we make these things, these
Yeah,
places on the page with words, as a place to be,
yeah.
Yeah, I don't belong in the
Absolutely.
rural. I'm a freak there, But in the city, when I lived there, people would say, "Why do you talk like that? Why do you smile? Why do you look at people? Just walk, walk." That I couldn't find the horizon. So wherever when I'm in academia, I don't, I feel like a monster, but when I'm not, I feel like I'm talking strange, at the grocery store. So there is no place. And from the poets I know, I think that um, there's something that we do, we keep attempting. You do it through the images that you create, the visual stuff, but every step along the way in Yellow Rain, you're making us, you're burrowing through information to try to create a space for yourself.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, maybe that's what it is that, there is a way in which we're creating this figurative, metaphorical, spiritual space that we can't find in the living world right now. And it's something that we can harness when we do it on the page. Yeah.
Yeah, at least for that period of time of writing it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Right.
Mhm.
That might be a really wonderful place for us to close. Thank you, Diane. Thank you, Maider, for your reading and for this conversation. Let's turn things over to Rob for some audience Q&A. If you are ready to come on, Rob. Thank you, Rob, for doing that. And thanks everyone for being here and listening in.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for inviting me to the screen and for that totally compelling, engrossing conversation that you just saw over. And thank you, Maider and Diane, for your words. Hi, everyone. I'm Rob Gowdy. I am the events director for Friends of the Hennepin County Library. And it's my pleasure to join the program tonight to moderate the audience Q&A portion when we get to hear from you. So thank you to everyone who's already added your question. If you'd like to add a question, please just click the Q&A icon on the bottom center of the screen. And with that, let's get started. We have a question from Connie, and I believe both of you can answer this one. Can you talk more about risk? Is there a risk level you work with and or are aware of when you write? Do you find at times some poems feel too risky or not risky enough? Who'd like to go first?
Well, I can dive into that idea of risk. I think risk is probably something that is different for every poet, and everyone sort of approaches risk differently. And I think that for me, there was a period in my life when I was writing when I felt so restricted and like I felt so confined to have to overdo things in my writing or over explain things. Like I needed to clarify myself. I needed to communicate properly. But I feel like going through the educational system my life and learning to write and have good grammar, right? All of those things condition us to remove ourselves from risk so that we can communicate properly, right?
Mhm.
And so part of what I think I've try to do as a poet is how can I renew my ability to take healthy creative risk in my work, right? That is outside of what I might have been conditioned to do, right? By the education system or whatever else I've had to learn to do in my life. And so I think for me, risk can be as simple as, writing a poem and feeling as though you can do something really crazy and weird and interesting with the syntax or the grammar, the grammatical construction of that line, so that what you end up with is something that is not grammatically correct, but is poetry, I think that there is risk in something as little as that to then something even much bigger, like, when you're allowing yourself to come through in a poem, and allowing yourself to speak in a way where you're sharing something that is a little harder to share, that can also be a way of allowing for that healthy risk to come through too. So yeah, Diane, what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, well, there's sort of two things that come to mind. And one is, I think at some point I stopped trying to be the hero of the poems. And it's something I suggest, I think, to writers, is that to sort of put down the heroics, and that's a risk, because you risk looking bad, but for me anyway, I am bad, so let's just get it out on the table. So like to humanize yourself and to not look so good, I think is
Yeah.
a good risk. The other thing is, I make this challenge to myself that whatever I feel I kind of got, like, right now with Frank, I got the sonnet, man, and I got memoir. I understand what I was doing in that book. And the temptation, of course, is, well, I'll do it again. I have more horrific stories for you. But what I challenge myself to do is whatever I haven't done already. And so every book, I mean, it's by me if you read it, but I can't escape that, unfortunately. But the risk is, for instance, in what I'm coming out with in a couple of years, it's free verse and no sonnets, and there are some ballads, but they're sort of iffy ballads. It's more rhetorical. I'm writing about poetry. And is that going to be okay? People who really liked Frank, maybe they'll be like, ugh. But I think in terms of I want a dynamic creative life. I want to feel that I've leaped between projects, and that makes me feel alive.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much for those generous answers, and for showing up as representatives of your books tonight. It's such a pleasure, having read the books, to see them come alive through both of you. You both represent yourself so well. So thanks for that. We've had a couple questions about writing process. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about process. And one question in particular seems to hone in on a particular part of the process. This is from Roberta. These books are so powerful as books, meaning an integral project. I'm wondering if they started out that way, a vision of the whole, or if not, at what point did you realize you had something larger on your hands, and what was that moment like?
Yeah, that's always a good question to ask, right? When it comes to like thinking about what are the stages of the work, or what happens first, and then second, and then third, and how do you take the book to where it is? And I think for me, I'll just be honest and say I really had no idea how this was going to evolve, right? It was started with a question, and it started with an obsession and a curiosity. And I just really like latched onto it. And I was like, there's something about this topic of yellow rain that really bothers me. It bothers me, and it bothered me like in a way that it was a healthy way of bothering, some things can be kind of over the top, but this was something that I knew my gut and my intuition said I have to come back to this, because I first heard about yellow rain many years ago when I was an undergrad, and I knew I had to come back to it. And I think in the process of coming back to it, and then digging further, and then finding what I found, and then just realizing that there was a larger story to tell, and again, what you were saying, Diane, earlier about the sort of the push and pull between erasure and what was erasure and exposure. Yeah. That was something too that I felt like happening as I was working on this. And I said, okay, so now what do I do? Maybe this is going to be a book of poems. Or maybe what is it going to be? And so I just started writing. I just did it, and it was a very long process because I spent most of the years doing this book in like reading documents and researching. But somehow you feel like at the very beginning you're lost, you're confused, you're uncertain about where this is all going to lead. Is this all just going to be in vain? Is this, are you, and first of all, like, well, I mean, second of all, like my other concern was, who am I to think that I'm going to challenge the official story on Yellow Rain? Who am I? Right? Like I had those issues too. On top of just the challenge of doing the research, I had these issues around my own confidence to even do this stuff, to be even like writing about a topic that I'm not even an expert on. So it took many years of like building up my confidence and saying, yeah, I can do this. And, I think I have a right to do this. And then that's when the poems finally were able to come along, was when I could just stop feeling as though I could, didn't have what it took. But when I could finally get to a point where I said, there's so much rage in me that I need to write this, and that's what I think helped my process along, to realize that, yeah, this is going to have to be a project collection. And that's what it shaped up to be, was just this project book about Yellow Rain, and trying to draw together as much as I could from what I had found out.
And there's somewhere along the line you took authority, or you felt you had a right to a certain kind of authority. And I think even the process of getting to that authority is part of the book.
Mm-hmm, right. Mm-hmm. I agree. Yeah. Yeah. And it's not something that you feel right away when you're starting a book too, right? You're still questioning a lot of things, but the more that you spend time with it, the more that you labor with it, and you might want to like just shove it to the side, but you kind of keep coming back to it. Right.
I love that vulnerability.
Yeah.
I mean, when we think about a lot of the poets of yore, who seem so confident in the poems, you never get to see the crack, you never get to see the vulnerability. That's why I love Keats, because we see it, we see it.
Yeah. Yeah.
For me, I people had said, you should write a memoir. And I would, I walked around with that idea, and I just couldn't hear it in prose. I just couldn't hear it.
Mm-hmm.
And books for me start with, oh, I hear that. I hear how that's going to sound. And I did a residency out in Washington State, and I mean, just as the first poem in Frank details, I drove all the way to Cape Disappointment, and then and I got to Cape Disappointment, and I couldn't really get the gumption to get out of the car and walk out to this lighthouse. And so I took a nap in the car, the rental. And then I woke up and drove back to my little cottage, and I noticed myself narrating. I drove all the way, and I'm kind of like Frank O'Hara, but without the handsome nose and the penis and the New York school, and and it just it came forth as diction, as a character. And I thought, oh, I can narrate what just happened. And that's a Frank O'Hara thing, that sort of, he called it, I do this, I do that poems. And he just walked into the poem. I didn't invite him. He just walked in, and he kind of said, stay in the moment. Even if you're remembering, remembering is in the moment. It's a present tense act. And by the time I got back to the cottage, and I had written the lines on the passenger seat on a pad, and I got them on the computer, and I thought, these could be 14 lines. And maybe this could be a sonnet. And even that ending, how do I explain this restless search for beauty or relief? That's sort of couplety, that kind of rhetorically moves up. And then I thought, well, Eureka, I could write a memoir in sonnets. And
Yeah. Do you feel, just a quick question, do you feel like you heard of these poems before? Like, could you hear them already before you even wrote them? Could you feel them? Like, there's something, right? Like you can feel it, you hear their cadence or something.
Yeah, I heard their voice. I heard where they would come from. And I didn't know where it would end up, or, I like the feeling of discovery that you're talking about, Miter. I don't know where this is going. I'm just going to follow it poem to poem, but I did know I had that eye that Jeff spoke of, and I had the sonnet, and I had my life. So that's a lot to have.
Well, thank you so much for so willingly sharing your life and for going to Cape Disappointment.
Oh, isn't it great?
Yeah.
I mean, I couldn't make up that stuff. Life is so perfect with handing you Cape Disappointment.
Well, we do have time for one more question, but before we do, I just want to remind everyone, if you have not yet read or purchased Frank Sonnets or Yellow Rain, these two beautiful editions published by Grey Wolf Press, we'd like to request that you purchase a copy through our event bookseller partner, Majors and Quinn. I'm dropping those links in the chat right now. And you won't be disappointed, as I'm sure you know from the conversation tonight. There's so much wonder and joy to behold in these collections. So thank you for making your purchase locally. It does help our local literary community to thrive when you do so. And you're supporting us, you're supporting Grey Wolf, you're supporting our literary community. So thanks. So the final question, I've seen a couple about beginnings as poets, and I'm just going to combine a couple. One is, what inspired you to become a poet? And another is, who were your favorite poets in college, the voices that first engaged your imagination? Who would like to begin?
I can start, and then
go ahead.
Well, it's funny because my next book is called Modern Poetry, which was the title of my first poetry class in college. And
it was the title of my poetry class too. I had a
was it?
Yes.
Twins.
Yes. Yeah.
So yeah, and we read Theodore Retke, a Michigan poet, and William Carlos Williams Hopkins, who blew my mind, Wallace Stevens, and Sylvia Plath. Got to get her in there. And so that's what I knew of poetry and modernism. And I don't know that I was inspired to be a poet. It just was who I was, I could do it. It was something I could do early on. I could read early, and I could hear poems in my head early. I think in first grade, I wrote a poem for Mother's Day, and it made sense, subtraction didn't, but it made sense. But, I tried other things, anthropology major, theater, I did acting, but it suited my nature. And I was a social worker. I was a therapist for a long time. So it suited my nature. And I hear language, born with it, born this way.
That's great, Diane. I love that. Yeah, I don't know at what point things just fell into place for me. It was just sort of something I did. I grew up in a family where, in a very traditional Hmong family, a multi-generational household where my grandma lived with us too. And so, you know, as a child, I did a lot of translating for my parents whenever we went anywhere, to the doctor's office, to the grocery stores, taking the rent to pay our landlord. You know, that was something that we did as kids. And it never occurred to me that I was actually kind of good at communicating with people until I was in school. And I for whatever reason in elementary school, I did really well in English, and I wrote all kinds of plays and stories as a kid. I wrote about monsters. I wrote about outer space, you know, just those. And I loved libraries too. Speaking of libraries, you know, I think libraries were, it was one of the places as a kid where I was like, oh, I can take these books home. Wow, I didn't know that, you know? And so I loved going to libraries too as a child, and just being able to immerse myself in anything I could find there. And so, so I think over time, I just became, you know, really, you know, fell into and leaned into my love for literature, and continued that through to my undergraduate studies at where I majored in English too. But I would cite some of the early poets, one being Emily Dickinson, who I studied in high school, and who was so weird to me, and it still is, but in all the best ways. So yeah.
Yeah, same. You know, we had a little, my mom went to college after my dad died and brought books into the house, and she became an English major. And so
Mm.
there were the spines. I was 7, 8, Virginia Woolf, James Joyce,
Mhm.
Chaucer, the Romantic poets, you know. And you know, I didn't know what they were yet, but they had heft. They had a sense of possibility. I mean, she went to school as a way of not, you know, grieving for the rest of her
Mhm.
life and making a new life for herself. So books felt that way to me.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And with those wonderful answers, we are going to bring this program to a close tonight. Thank you so much, Diane and Maider, for spending time with us this evening. And I'm struck by a comment that Maider made earlier of creating ripples in people's lives. And I think if you've seen the chat at all tonight, you've definitely created some ripples in the lives of our library community. So thank you.
Well, you started it because you invited us. So
Yes.
thank you, Rob. And
thank you. And I would be remiss if I did not say congratulations on your Pulitzer honors. It is
Thank
such
you.
a thrill to have such wonderful decorated poets with us here at Hennepin County Library. And I do have one more thought before we go. If you enjoyed tonight's program, please consider joining us this fall as we kick off a new season of our ticketed event series, Pen Pals. This series is returning to Hopkins Center for the Arts on September 20th with special guest Michelle Zahner, author of Crying in H Mart. So I'm going to drop some links in the chat. Those links to purchase Diane and Maider's books and links to purchase tickets to Pen Pals. Thanks also to Jeff Schatz for his wonderful moderating of the early conversation. So on behalf of Friends of the Hennepin County Library, thank you for spending another summer evening with us, wherever you may be. And everyone have a good night. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much for listening. I love you, Maider.
I love you too, Diane. Thank you. I hope we meet in person soon at some point, right?
Me too.